Igor Zevelev is a fellow with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and is a former director of the MacArthur Foundation's Moscow office. Igor, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you for hearing me.
I want to ask you, I was trying to figure out where to start this conversation, and I wrote down Vladimir Putin talked about almost as much as Donald Trump. Maybe not that much, but certainly in the United States as much as any politician other than Donald Trump. Does this come as a surprise to you that Vladimir Putin is occupying this much space in the U.S. consciousness?
Absolutely. I have never seen anything like that since my first visit to the United States in 1989. Russia all over the front pages, and it all started with the presidential campaign, and it is still there.
How would you characterize the current state of relations between the U.S. and Russia?
It cannot go any worse, and the reason
really an all-time low?
Yeah, absolutely, at all-time low, and there is an influential school of thought arguing that it's a new Cold War, and basically I agree with this perspective.
So you don't think that's just hyperbole or colorful talk using a historic reference? You think that really the tensions are at the same kind of level they were during the original Cold War?
Or maybe even worse, because it is less predictable. Somehow we learned how to live and even cooperate in certain areas during the Cold War, but we are in uncharted waters now, and I cannot predict where the relationship will go later this year or just in 2 weeks. Very unpredictable.
What do you make of this, the investigation into Russian meddling in the election, allegations that there are connections potentially between the then Trump campaign and Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin? What is your assessment of either probability, possibility, anything that you can tell us from your perspective?
I personally have not seen a smoking gun yet, and nobody has shown it to me. But what worries me is that there is an increasingly blurred line between domestic politics and foreign policy in the United States. And the same situation is in Russia. And Russian-American relations are actually like a hostage of domestic politics in both countries, and this is very worrisome.
Is this idea of espionage and Russian meddling consistent with the Vladimir Putin that you know?
Well, once again, I have not seen a smoking gun yet, but many people in this city believe that indeed Russia-controlled entities hacked important emails from the Democratic Party. And the question is whether there was a collusion or not. But once again, I'm more concerned about not tiny facts from time to time coming to the media, but I'm concerned with the impact of this story on Russian-American relations. And we're talking about a relationship between two nuclear powers that can destroy each other so easily. And that worries me much more than new small details in this scandal.
How do the two countries move on from this low point?
Well, I think it would be insane for both sides to continue what is going on right now. And first of all, it's time to recognize that there are so important issues that unite us. And this is armed control, non-proliferation, combat against terrorism, and other global issues like the Arctic. We can cooperate there. And I understand that at this moment, relationship cannot be anything else but transactional. There cannot be grand strategy right now. There cannot be a big deal between the two countries, but we should start talking immediately. And I'm very worried by the fact that the lines of communications are so limited as at this moment, and they certainly should be restored immediately, because not talking is not a policy and dialogue is not a reward. Both countries are interested in restoring the dialogue, and renewing cooperation in the key areas.
You mentioned the Arctic, and we saw the recent announcement by Russia that you can now take a virtual tour of their new military base just unveiled in the Arctic, and plans to build other bases. Mike Sfraga, who works here and heads the Polar Initiative, has said that the Arctic represents almost an island of sanity amidst all of these tensions, where there is cooperation currently between the U.S. and Russia and other Arctic nations. Do you expect that to continue, or will the Arctic be swept into this sort of second Cold War, as you've called it?
I see two trends in the Arctic, and the first you referred to is opportunity for cooperation, and some cooperation is going on in the Arctic between not only the United States and Russia, but all Arctic countries. But there is also another trend, and this is increasing militarization of the Arctic. And we're talking about deployments of new units in the Arctic. And this is also worrisome. And it remains to be seen how it develops in the Arctic. But this is the area definitely which provides us a huge opportunity to cooperate.
The question has come up from time to time, what does Putin want, or what does Russia want? And sometimes these are used interchangeably as if they're one and the same. Maybe I should start there. Are they one and the same?
Well, to a large degree today, and Russian politics is over-personalized, and its foreign policy, its presidential foreign policy, so it would be adequate to talk about Putin's foreign policy, but at the same time we should recognize the fact that Putin's policies are based on history and tradition, and in most cases reflect consensus or something that looks like consensus within the Russian elite. So it doesn't make much difference if we talk about Putin's foreign policy or Russian foreign policy today. So, and my reading of Putin's foreign policy main goal on the international arena is to restore Russian status as a great power. And he sees Russia as a great power with a mission. And all our objectives on the international arena derive from that. And they include a special role in Eurasia and belief in the existence of Russia's sphere of privileged interests around Russia. That includes the attempt to limit the U.S. leadership role on the world arena, because a unipolar world and a multipolar world are two different things for Russia. And Russia would feel much more comfortable in a multipolar world today as the Kremlin sees it. So the goal is, yes, to limit the American leadership in the world, and we should recognize that.
I know that you're doing research currently on the role of national identity in these matters. Is that the best lens for a U.S. audience attempting to understand Vladimir Putin or Russia? Is that the best lens to use to try to think in terms of national identity and how that motivates an individual or a country?
I wouldn't go that far as arguing that it is the best lens. I would say this is a helpful lens, because it allows me in my research to put current Russian foreign policy in the framework of a long tradition started in early 19th century. And currently I read Russian conservatives of the 19th century and how they thought. I'm trying to understand how did they think about Russia's role in the world, and I see many Putin's policies as a continuation of that conservative tradition of the 19th century. It is too bad that the Kremlin doesn't engage to a similar extent Russian liberal tradition, which was also very powerful, and the Kremlin uses different historic intellectual legacies as a toolkit, using and engaging those of ideas that serve the current interests as interpreted by the Kremlin.
Is the Kremlin's approach to the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution an example of what you're talking about?
It will be a big challenge how to interpret the Russian Revolution, and there have been several interesting conferences, including one here at the Wilson Center organized by the Kennan Institute about the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And for the Kremlin, as far as I see it, it's a challenge. On the one hand, the Kremlin emphasizes continuity of Russian history. From the Kremlin perspective, the Russian Federation is almost the same as Imperial Russia or the Soviet Union, and that means that all pages of often tragic history of my country, is a part of that history, but at the same time, ideology of the Kremlin today is conservatism, and it is against any kind of revolution. And from this perspective, the revolution is definitely a negative thing. So it's a very interesting balance the Kremlin must to say, because engaging history is a very important part of the Kremlin's effort to legitimize the regime.
Final thought, Igor, from history to current events, the round of protests that we've seen. Put these in a context for us. Is this a movement? Is this something that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin are very worried about? Or is this just an anomalous moment that really won't amount to much in the big picture?
I believe that the Kremlin must be very worried about that. And the recent protest that took place earlier this year is very different from the protests that shook the country in late 2011 and first half of 2012. A lot of people came out in spite of the fact that in most cities around the country, the rallies and demonstrations were not sanctioned by the authorities. So people took a lot of risk and they came out anyway. The second thing, in the past several years ago, most of the protests were organized by a coalition of forces, liberal opposition, nationalist opposition to the Kremlin, but this time it was organized effectively by one man, and his name is Alexei Navalny. And the third difference between the recent protest and the protests we had before is that a lot of very young people came out, and this is a big difference, and I would be very much surprised if the Kremlin doesn't worry about that.
The generational change is a threat to a lot of old orders.
Absolutely.
Igor, thank you for joining us. A pleasure to have you here at the Wilson Center. I look forward to speaking to you again.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.